Perhaps a familiar list to you, a list of the books that make up the Old Testament. In this series we're going to focus on the third book, Leviticus. A very neglected book, and perhaps a very misunderstood book. The book of Leviticus. There are reactions to this book. For some, it's seen as a book full of rules and regulations. Therefore, it's not relevant today. Parts of it describe the conduct of sacrifices, procedures that are totally out of date for today. And much is built around a priestly system which doesn't exist today. What is the relevance of the book of Leviticus? If we go back into Exodus, the previous book, that's what God told Moses to tell the people released from slavery in Egypt, who saw no future, and God said to them, "You will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Just what are the practical implications of that remarkable statement? That's where Leviticus comes in. It works out the practical implications for the people who are about to spend some time living in a desert environment. Kingdom of priests? They were all to be priests, not just a select few. Because their task was to make God known, to make God real for the people groups that lived round about. I suspect the people will be utterly amazed at that idea. And a holy nation? This implies high quality, fulfilled living. Living lives the way God intended us to live them. Full of purpose, joy, fulfillment, happiness. What does that mean? Leviticus works it out in a desert context. As a book, it's highly organized and systematic. Here's a possible way of dividing it up. It starts with instructions for the people about sacrifices, which is a very strange place to start. But we must see it in context. This runs throughout the first 5 chapters, and although I put it down as chapters 1 to 5, it just edges into chapter 6. Then it looks about the people who would actually carry it out, called priests. Instructions for them, and indeed it looks at the whole concept of priesthood. It moves on to something that's very strange. The concept of uncleanness. Very strange in our modern way of thinking. But we'll unpack this and look at it and see its relevance for today. And then the last stretch is the longest stretch of all, which looks at aspects of practical holiness. Living lives the God way, the Jesus way, the way God intended it to be, the way that's most fulfilling, that gives us the greatest joy and sense of purpose. But again, we've got to interpret that because it was written to a people group in a desert context. So it's quite organized. The question is, who wrote the book? Now, all sorts of people have made all sorts of statements and opinions and assertions, some of them based on a lot of evidence, some of them just their opinions. What does the evidence suggest? Well, that's what the book actually states. That what is taught in this book was given to Moses, but it doesn't actually say that Moses wrote the book himself. That belief occurred many, many centuries into the Christian era. Moses may have written it because he was literate and most of the people in those days were not. But it's perfectly possible that someone wrote it down and Moses gave them directions. And it's perfectly possible, having written it down, someone else would have edited and smoothed it off. That's the normal way a book might be written. But whatever else is true, everything in the book fits into the desert experience of a people group. Tabernacle, the fancy word that just means a kind of mobile temple, because the people group in the desert were moving from place to place, oasis to oasis. And everything fits into that kind of context and situation. So the content of the book deals with the issues of the day of Moses, when he was the leader. It doesn't address later issues, and suggest it does is reading things backwards into it. We must look at it in the context where it is set and interpret it in that context, and then see what the implications are for today. It's quoted quite a bit. You find it quoted in the prophecy of Ezekiel. It's also quoted in Deuteronomy and Joshua. So whatever else is true, it predates these books. So the best way of looking at this book is a book that was put together in the desert period in the time of Moses, perhaps dictated or directed in some way by Moses. And it's set in the context of a people group that escaped from slavery, and it's working out God's directions for lifestyle and living, and their purpose in living in that context. And we're going to interpret it that way. So I've summarized it this way. However it was written and by whomsoever it was written, it was compiled in the days of Moses. And it gives a framework for desert living. Not a rule book, a framework. For a people group, as they moved from slavery, to move forward to fulfill what God had for them. To be a priesthood for all people and a holy nation. To make God known to the people groups of the surrounding nations, and to live quality living, quality lives, fulfilling all the richness that God had for us and has for us today in our lives. And as such, it is much to say to us today. But who was the intended audience? Those days most people couldn't read or write. So the book would have been read to them, spoken. And it was a group of former slaves. You could call them a rabble, and that's a pretty good description, looking at their behavior. Not surprising they behaved that way. They've been in slavery for hundreds of years. They thought as slaves. They could only take a decision for themselves. They had to do what they were told. They've been released from Egypt and now suddenly launched into an uncertain career. And they're under a leader, Moses, they scarcely knew. Highly educated. He knew his way around the Egyptian court. He knew his way about how to survive in the desert, having lived there with his wife and children for many years. But a man who was very close to God. And these people had little idea what was happening to them. Their jaws must have dropped when they saw some of the things that just happened before their eyes. They'd never been in the desert. They had no experience of this. They'd never seen miracles. And they had no idea what was going on half the time. And they didn't really understand what lay ahead. They didn't see their destiny. Now that's totally understandable. They had to be drawn forward under the great leader Moses. And they didn't really understand much about God anyway. Moses had learned a lot, and his desert experiences had taught him a lot. And the family of Moses and an inner group knew a bit. But the people probably didn't. Then they had to be taught, directed and led, and Leviticus is part of that. So you could summarize it that way. They were full of uncertainty and fear. Yes, there was a sense of excitement. They'd been released from slavery. But there was hankering back to slavery, because at least then they didn't have to think. They just did what they were told. Here in the desert, everything was uncertain. They had to take decisions, move forward. Life was uncertain. Food supplies, water supplies were uncertain. And they didn't know what was lying ahead. So that's the audience. And we have to interpret it in the light of that audience. Now, there are some important themes in Leviticus. Now, this is going to be rather superficial, because we're going to touch into these themes in subsequent presentations. But these themes are much, much bigger than just the book of Leviticus. And they affect us in our living throughout the world today. The book speaks about the presence of God. And it's stressing the point that successful living depends on God being with us. God is not distant. Yes, he's distant in the sense that he made the entire universe. He's distant in the sense that he's far greater, bigger, more powerful, and he's absolutely morally perfect. But God can be known. God can be with us. Now, that was a completely new idea for the people. Moses had got it, and some of the group around him had got it, but the people didn't really understand that. They'd kept God at a distance, and God was there to be known in the ordinary things of life, and was needed for successful living. And then there's the idea of holiness. The gods of the Egyptians had all sorts of characteristics. Very many of these were just pictures of how humans behave. And that's typical of the people groups of the time. But the idea of a God who was different, an idea of a God who was morally and ethically perfect, not thought of in terms of how human beings behave. And the idea of making God the top priority in our living, the practical things of life, and that our lives should reflect something of his nature and character. The people were called to be holy, as God is holy. That's not restrictive. That's fulfilled, rich living in every sense of the words. And too often today we picture things as rules and restrictions. That's not the way God works. And the people struggled with that idea. And we still struggle with it today. And then there's the strange world of sacrifice. How do we bridge the gap between rebellious humanity? We want to do it our way. We think we know best. We don't. God made us. And because God made us, and he made this universe, he made this world, God knows the best way for us. The way that will give life the greatest fulfillment and richness and sense of purpose. But so often we still are rebellious. We still think we know better than God. And somehow into that, there's a picture of sacrifice, there's a bridging the gap. And we'll develop that throughout this series. Then another strange word, the word covenant. There's a picture of God choosing this people group, this nation, this rabble of slaves. And the idea of choosing them, too often that carries the idea that they were special. Made very clear they were not special. There was nothing particularly good about them at all. God chooses people for purposes. He does not choose people because we deserve it, earn it, or impress him in some way. And this people group, God chose them because God wanted to make himself known to the wider world of humanity. And he chose a people group, set them up on a piece of land that straddled Africa and led into Asia and Europe. Transit point for trade routes. And he chose this people group to make himself known so that other nations could get the benefits of the living and the lifestyle that God has intended for humanity. Quality living, holiness. Now let's move on a little bit further. I'm going to take each of these themes and I'm just going to give a thought or two. I hope this will start you thinking, and as we proceed through this book, these can be developed further. We have a problem in our society today. We think of God when we go to church, and we think of church as a building. We think of God being present in all our religious rituals which go on inside churches. And indeed, the tendency is in the Western world today for our political masters to want religion locked up in churches and religious buildings. They don't want religious ideas to have any impact on society. But we've allowed it to happen. You see, God is present. Present in the rituals of worship and sacrifice in the language of Leviticus. But what the book is making very clear, and the people had to grasp, and we find it difficult to grasp, God is present and wants to be present in the ordinary things of daily life. Just stop and ponder. Ponder what you're going to do today, tomorrow. We live in families, or people groups, relationships, workplace, travel, holidays, recreation. God wants to be present in these ordinary things of daily life. And he wants to enrich them and lead us through them. Not in a restrictive way, but in an enhancing, enriching way. And God wants to escape from our church buildings into everything in life. And what Leviticus shows very clearly is God's present, regulating, directing, being there for us in every aspect of life, not in a restrictive sense, but in an enriching sense. But there are conditions. God does not force himself into our lives. We're given free will, free choice. And God's presence is conditional on our willingness to listen to him and live his way. Or we could put it, God's presence is conditional on your willingness to listen to him and live his way. Life will be richer, but we've got to be willing. And that's an underpinning theme in the book of Leviticus. Now let's look at the idea of holiness. It's interesting that nearly 30% of all the uses of the words that connect to holiness, 30% in the whole Old Testament, it comes in Leviticus. It's a very strong theme. But we see it in 3 words. Now, to our modern minds, we look at these 3 words and we say, what on earth do they mean? The danger is we interpret them in terms of our modern thinking. What do they mean for the author of the book of Leviticus? Well, clean refers to what we might call the normal state of all creation. If we go back to Genesis, God made the entire universe. And he made this world. And he looked in this world that he'd made and he described it as good, very good. And when we start to make up rules that say we can't do this, can't do that, can't eat this, can't drink that, then we're undermining it, or are in danger of undermining that. God made it clean. God made it good. But it can become unclean from natural causes because we live in a fallen world. It's been messed up by the work of Satan. Or it can become unclean because of things that we have decided to do with it. We abuse our world. And we abuse the good things in the world. At the other end, the word holy. Now the word holy carries quite a wide width of meaning. In one sense, it's a picture of wholeness or completeness. And if you like it, that describes God. God, by his very nature, the fact that he is the creator, Lord of the universe, can be described in terms of wholeness or completeness. He encompasses everything. But the word also carries the idea of separated for God. Things that have been set apart. Set apart to be whole or complete, because God is whole and complete. Now we can turn, or indeed fallen nature can turn, things that are clean. God made them good. And they can be polluted to be unclean. Equally, we can turn things that are clean and set them apart for God. Now the word sanctify is just a fancy word that means make holy. In the original language, it's just the verb to make holy, which connects onto the word holy. Or we can take unclean things, things that have been messed up, we can clean them up. Or allow them to be cleaned up by God's intervention. But equally, we can take things that should be set apart for God, including the quality of our own living, and we can profane them and move them away from God, move them away from wholeness or completeness. I'm going to suggest a very deep thought here. We'll pick it up in a moment or two. When we look at these transfers, that's moving from right to left, unclean to clean, clean to holy. It requires a combination of human action and divine enabling. Put it this way, we've got to be willing. We've got to want to do it. But God does it, and we've got to be willing to do it his way. Because God provides the resources and the enabling to make it possible. There's a combination of human willingness to take action and the divine power to make the action possible. That deep thought is worth pondering because it applies as a principle in all of life. Let's move on to the role of sacrifice. And I'm going to put up the same three words. There's a progression, sadly, from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. Sin is our deliberate rebellion. Our choice that we want to do it our way. We know better than God. Plus the whole question of disease and uncleanness that's in the world that comes from the fallen nature of the world, where Satan has messed up God's creation. And things can be moved from the left to the right, but equally things can be moved from the right to the left. And our part in this is responding to what God wants things to be like. God wants things to be clean and holy. And it requires a sacrifice on our part to move things from right to left. Just one verse from Leviticus in the section that deals with sacrifice. Speaking of a sacrifice, it says, "In this way the priest will make atonement for the community, and they will be forgiven." In a later presentation we'll look at that word atonement, which is so often misunderstood. Literally it says he is pardoned to them. We make the sacrifice, but God does the pardoning and releases it to us. God undoes the consequences within us and within others of our rebellion. But we've got to be willing. And we show we are willing by making the sacrifice. That's the context of the sacrificial system, and that's the lesson for us today. Even though the practice of sacrifices in the Leviticus way has long since gone, the principle still stands. And we can move things from the right to the left. Let's finally look at the word covenant. God rescued the people. God wanted to develop this people group to live a quality of lifestyle which would be rich and fulfilled. And by that quality lifestyle to make God known to the people groups around. To a large extent they failed. But to a large extent they succeeded, because from that people group Jesus was born. And in the life of Jesus, the lifestyle of God was seen in perfection. And God provided the directions, not a rule book, the directions for the kind of lifestyle that would make life rich and fulfilled. God took the initiative, and we call that grace. God doing for us what we cannot do for ourselves, we don't deserve, we cannot earn. The people were in slavery. They had no chance of escaping from the powerful Egyptian overlords with their army, armaments, and oppression. God took the initiative, and He always does. And He offered the people freedom. Freedom from slavery. But free to respond. But there are conditions attached. We don't earn God's favor. God, by His grace, takes the initiative, but He wants a response. If we respond, we benefit from all that God has for us. And it's a benefit. It's not a rule book. It's not restrictive. God wants us to enjoy life to the richest and fullest possible. And it's there for us if we live His way. But when we choose not to do it His way, He doesn't force it on us. It's your choice, my choice. And you can see in the Old Testament the working out of that principle with the nation group that became known as Israel, where so often they chose to do it their way. They thought they knew best. And they lost out on the rich blessings that God had for them. That's covenant. Well, what about today? You can look through the Old Testament law, as it's called, and that word has got kind of overtones that mislead us a bit. And you can see that it goes in 3 directions. There's things that are clearly moral, ethical. For example, the 10 Commandments is an example of this. And this basically shows us how to treat each other and helps the whole society to work well. Then there's what we could call civil law, which is the kind of legislation just to run society and get things to move smoothly. And then there's what we might call ceremonial law, which deals with the sacrificial system, for example, which we'll look at in the next presentation. Now, the interesting thing is that if you look at the book of Leviticus, which outlines the principles for rich and wonderful living for a desert people, Leviticus sees all that as one complete package. We mentally separate it out in our Western cultures today. And we lock up the ceremonial in our churches. We leave our governments to run the civil law. And at the moment, the moral laws have gone all over the place. Leviticus does not separate them. It sees them as one complete package. But we've got to interpret them in the context of a desert people who'd escaped from slavery and who are being prepared for a destiny, a future. We have to interpret them in that context. And having got that, the principles then become obvious and apply to any and every culture. So there's great relevance for us today. But Leviticus sees all of this as one complete package because they all stem from the nature of God himself. Now, if you look at how Jesus saw it, he got this. Asked the question about the most important law, he said this: Hear, O Israel, that's the people group, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Now, these are very strong words, taken right from the Old Testament. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And every part of us. And the second is like this: love your neighbour as yourself. And then he makes the point, there's no commandment greater than these. That's the principle for rich and wonderful living. And it starts with God. There is one God. And that God created everything. That God is supreme and Lord over all of life. The practical, ordinary, daily things of our living. And we're called to respond. The word love is a word of action, not emotion. It's a word of decision, not feeling. We say, I want to do it God's way. The natural instinct of us is to want to do it my way. But we say, no, I take a decision. I want to do it God's way. And I devote my whole being, every part of my life, to his way. It's the better way. And the outcome? We start to live like God. I say that reverently. God's agenda is the best for you and me all the time. That's what love means. And we start to live for the benefit of others. Whoever is nearest to us. We're living seeking their benefit. Not living to satisfy our selfish desires. That's what Leviticus is working through. Starting with a people group who are still thinking with a slavery mentality. Today's language? Too often religion is pictured as something that puts a rule book on us and restricts us. Do this, do that, don't do the other. That's not the God of the Bible. And that's not the way Jesus saw life. Read the gospel stories. Jesus brings freedom, liberty, fulfillment, destiny. We enjoy life at its fullest. But it has that implication. When we do that, we find that we are starting to live for the benefit of others. And if we all live for the benefit of others, just ponder for a moment what a wonderful world it would be. And that's the wonderful world that God wants for humanity, and that so often we forfeit. And Leviticus reminds us that when we get God at the center of everything, not only do we live life to the fullest, but we bring great blessing to everyone we meet in every circumstance of life. That is the message for Leviticus for us today. In the next presentation, we're going to be looking at the strange world of sacrifices.